17 messages waited on my phone when I woke up the morning after posting the photographs. 17 messages from a family that had not acknowledged my birthday in 8 consecutive years. The images showed a Mediterranean villa perched above sapphire waters, its terraces cascading down toward a private beach. My caption had been deliberately simple: best birthday gift I could ever give myself. Within hours, the silence that had defined my relationship with my family for nearly a decade shattered completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They thought my posting meant invitation. It did not. It meant declaration. By the time they arranged an emergency family dinner to discuss my unexpected acquisition, I had already prepared something that would ensure this birthday became one they would remember for entirely different reasons than I had spent years trying to forget. For as long as memory serves, birthdays in our family were never about celebration. They were about hierarchy. My father, Richard Sterling, had built his wealth through commercial real estate development across the southwestern United States. His philosophy centered on the belief that family resources should be invested in family members who demonstrated the highest return potential. My mother, Catherine, had transitioned from a career in broadcast journalism to managing the family's public image and philanthropic presence. She possessed the particular skill of making generosity appear abundant in public while rationing it carefully in private. Then there was my older sister, Victoria, the designated successor to everything that mattered in the Sterling family narrative. Every achievement she reached became a family milestone worthy of elaborate recognition. Every goal she pursued received immediate resource allocation and enthusiastic support. The contrast between how our parents responded to her accomplishments versus mine was not subtle. It was policy. When I turned 13, they canceled my birthday dinner because Victoria had a charity gala she was co-chairing. I spent the evening alone in my room while the rest of the family attended an event where my sister gave a speech about the importance of supporting young people in pursuing their dreams. The irony was not lost on me even then, though I lacked the vocabulary to articulate what I was feeling. My grandmother, Elena, called that evening when she realized what had happened. She was furious that no one had celebrated with me, the only family member who seemed to notice or care about the pattern that was emerging. The years that followed confirmed this was not an isolated incident, but rather the establishment of a permanent dynamic. Our family home in Paradise Valley represented everything the Sterlings valued: impressive architecture, prestigious address, carefully maintained grounds that made the right impression on visitors and business associates. The house contained 6 bedrooms, but only certain occupants mattered. Behind the elegant facade and professionally decorated interiors were unspoken rules about whose needs took priority and whose could be indefinitely postponed. Every year, Victoria's birthday transformed our home into something resembling a private event venue. Caterers arrived with elaborate menus. Florists created arrangements that would not have looked out of place at high-end weddings. Guests included people whose names appeared regularly in business publications and society pages. The celebrations typically cost more than most families spent on entire weddings, and every detail received my parents' careful attention and approval. My birthdays, by contrast, became exercises in being forgotten. Sometimes they would remember a day or two later and offer a card with a generic message. Other years they would acknowledge the date with a text message sent from whoever happened to think of it first, usually my mother, with wording that felt copied from previous years. There were no gatherings, no special meals, no indication that the day held any significance worth interrupting regular schedules to acknowledge. Grandmother Elena tried to compensate for what my parents failed to provide. She would arrange private celebrations at her home, just the two of us, with homemade cake and thoughtful gifts that demonstrated she had actually paid attention to my interests and aspirations. Those afternoons were the only times birthdays felt like something other than reminders of my position in the family hierarchy. She would tell me stories about her own youth, about times when she had felt overlooked or underestimated, about how she had built a life that mattered regardless of whether others recognized its value. Those conversations planted seeds that would take years to fully germinate. By the time I reached 32, I had constructed an entirely separate existence from the family that barely acknowledged I existed. I had built a career in architectural preservation and adaptive reuse consulting, specializing in transforming historic properties into functional contemporary spaces, while maintaining their cultural and aesthetic significance. The work required technical expertise, creative problem-solving, and the ability to navigate complex negotiations between property owners, historical societies, and municipal planning departments. I had earned my position through relentless effort and consistent results, not through family connections or inherited advantages. My apartment in downtown Phoenix was modest by sterling family standards, but it was entirely mine. Every piece of furniture, every carefully selected artwork, every book on the shelves represented my own choices and my own resources. I had not asked my family for financial support since completing my graduate degree, and I had not been invited to family gatherings unless Victoria specifically needed something that required my professional expertise, at which point my presence became temporarily valuable. The exclusion from family celebrations had stopped hurting in the acute way it once had. The pain had transformed into something duller and more permanent, a background awareness that I existed outside the circle of people my parents considered worth their time and emotional investment. I had stopped expecting birthday acknowledgments. I had stopped hoping that this year might be different. I had accepted that my relationship with my family was transactional at best and typically non-existent. This year felt different from the beginning, though I could not have explained why. For the first time in my adult life, I did not feel that familiar ache as my birthday approached. I was not waiting for a phone call that would not come or hoping for an invitation that would never arrive. I was focused on something else entirely, something that had been developing for months and was finally reaching conclusion. The catalyst had been a number that appeared in my investment account summary 6 weeks before my birthday. The figure represented returns from a commercial property investment I had made 4 years earlier. A historic warehouse district I had helped redevelop had sold to a major development corporation for substantially more than initial projections had suggested possible. My share of the returns, combined with savings I had accumulated through years of careful financial management, created a sum I had never imagined possessing. $2.4 million. I stared at that number for a long time when it first appeared, trying to process what it meant and what possibilities it created. My first instinct was not to celebrate or to share the news. It was to consider what I could build with resources that were entirely my own, what kind of life I could create that had nothing to do with sterling family approval or validation. That evening, I began researching property markets in locations I had always wanted to explore, but had never prioritized because my career kept me anchored in the Southwest. I looked at coastal properties in California, mountain retreats in Colorado, historic estates in New England. Each search revealed possibilities, but nothing that created the immediate visceral response I was seeking until I expanded my search internationally. The villa appeared in my search results late one night when I should have been sleeping. The photograph showed a structure that seemed to grow organically from the cliffside along the Amalfi Coast in southern Italy. Stone and stucco walls in warm cream tones, terracotta tile roofs weathered by decades of Mediterranean sun, terraces overflowing with bougainvillea and citrus trees, and views across impossibly blue water toward distant mountains. The property had been recently renovated by a preservation specialist who understood how to modernize infrastructure while maintaining historical character. 3 bedrooms for bathrooms, chef's kitchen, infinity pool, and direct access to a small private beach via a stone stairway carved into the cliff face. The listed price was $1.9 million. I read the description 3 times, studied every photograph, researched the surrounding area and local property market conditions. Then I did something I had never done before with a decision of this magnitude. I trusted my immediate instinct rather than analyzing it into paralysis. I contacted the listing agent that same night, despite the time difference, and requested a virtual tour. The agent, a woman named Alessandra Conti, responded within hours. Her video presentation walked me through every room, every terrace, every detail of the property's history and recent renovation. She explained that the villa had belonged to a family for 3 generations before they reluctantly decided to sell due to circumstances that made maintaining a second home in Italy impractical. The family wanted the property to go to someone who would appreciate its history and character, rather than someone who would tear it down for a more contemporary structure. I made an offer the following day. The amount was slightly above asking price, contingent only on inspection and verification of ownership documentation. I explained to Alessandra that I was a preservation specialist who understood the cultural value of historic properties, and would honor the villa's character while making it my primary residence. Within 48 hours, the family had accepted my offer, expressing relief that the property would go to someone who shared their values about preservation and respect for historical architecture. The following month involved a complexity of international property transactions, legal documentation that required translation and notarization, bank transfers that made my financial advisors nervous about fraud risks, and coordination with Italian attorneys and property inspectors. I worked through each requirement methodically, treating the acquisition with the same professional attention I would apply to any client project. The process was consuming and occasionally frustrating, but each completed step brought me closer to owning something that represented absolute independence from everything connected to my family. The sale finalized 3 days before my birthday. I received confirmation from my Italian attorney that all documentation had been properly recorded, and the property was now legally mine. I sat in my apartment staring at that email, trying to fully comprehend what I had just done. I owned a villa on the Amalfi Coast. I had used resources I had earned independently to acquire something extraordinary, and I had accomplished all of this without seeking advice, approval, or involvement from anyone in my family. On my birthday morning, I woke early and spent an hour selecting photographs from the virtual tour and inspection documentation. I chose images that showcased the villa's most striking features: the main terrace at sunset with the coastline glowing golden in the late afternoon light, the infinity pool appearing to merge seamlessly with the sea beyond, the stone archways framing views of the garden, the master bedroom's French doors opening onto a private balcony. I uploaded the images to my social media accounts, which I rarely used but which I knew my family occasionally monitored to maintain awareness of my activities. The caption required careful consideration. I wanted something that would communicate my pride in this achievement, without revealing more information than necessary. After several drafts, I settled on simple directness. Best birthday gift I could ever give myself. I added a location tag for the Amalfi Coast and posted the images before I could second-guess the decision. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For the first hour after posting, nothing happened. I went about my morning routine, preparing coffee and reviewing work emails, occasionally glancing at my phone to see if anyone had responded to the post. A few professional contacts left congratulatory comments. My grandmother called within 90 minutes, her voice filled with excitement and pride. She asked dozens of questions about the property, the purchase process, my plans for when I would visit. She told me she was proud of what I had accomplished, and that she had always known I would build something remarkable entirely on my own terms. Then the messages from my immediate family began arriving. The first came from my mother at 10:30 in the morning. The message said simply, "We need to talk about this property purchase. Call me immediately." There was no birthday greeting, no congratulations, just the demand for immediate communication about something that was none of her concern. My father's message arrived 15 minutes later. "Your mother showed me your social media post. We need to discuss this as a family. This is not something you undertake without consultation." Again, no acknowledgement of my birthday, no recognition of the achievement, just assertion that I had violated some protocol by making a major decision without seeking sterling family approval. Victoria's message was longer and more detailed. "Mom and Dad are upset that you bought property without telling anyone. They think you might have made a poor investment decision, and they are worried about your financial stability. Also, this villa looks like it would be perfect for the family reunion we have been trying to plan. We should talk about how to coordinate everyone using the property so it gets proper use. Call me when you have time." I read these messages multiple times, feeling something shift inside me that I had not fully anticipated. They had not acknowledged my birthday in 8 years. Not once in nearly a decade had they sent a card, made a phone call, or indicated in any way that the anniversary of my birth warranted their attention. But within hours of seeing that I had acquired something valuable, something desirable, something they wanted access to, suddenly I was important enough to demand immediate family meetings and discussions about coordination and proper use of my property. Additional messages continued arriving throughout the morning. My mother sent 3 more increasingly insistent texts demanding that I call her. My father forwarded an article about the risks of international property investment. Victoria sent photographs of the villa to the family group chat with commentary about how the space would be ideal for hosting extended family gatherings. None of them, not a single person, mentioned my birthday or acknowledged that this acquisition represented my own achievement, using my own resources on a day that should have held personal significance. By noon, 17 messages had accumulated. 17 separate communications from people who had spent 8 years demonstrating through their silence that I did not matter enough to warrant basic acknowledgement. Now they wanted immediate access to my attention, my property, my carefully constructed independent life. I sat on my apartment balcony, looking out over the Phoenix skyline, and made a decision. I would not respond to their messages immediately. I would not allow their sudden interest to disrupt the peace I felt about my achievement. Instead, I would wait and see what developed, how far they would take this sudden recognition of my existence now that I possessed something they wanted. That evening my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. She called again 5 minutes later. Then my father called. Then Victoria. By 8 o'clock that evening, I had 17 missed calls to match the 17 messages from earlier in the day. The voicemails they left were remarkably similar in tone and content. They needed to talk to me urgently about my property purchase. They were concerned about my decision-making. They wanted to arrange a family dinner to discuss how the villa might benefit everyone. Not one voicemail wished me happy birthday or acknowledged that this day had any significance beyond my sudden acquisition of property they found desirable. I listened to each voicemail once, then archived them. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. For the first time in 8 years, my birthday had gotten my family's attention. But their attention was not about me or my accomplishment. It was about what they believed they could extract from my success. They thought my silence meant guilt or uncertainty about my decision. They were wrong. My silence meant I was finally ready to establish boundaries that should have existed decades ago. By the time I agreed to attend the family dinner they were so insistent on arranging, I would have prepared something that would make this birthday one they would never forget. They had spent years teaching me that I did not matter to them. I was about to teach them that their opinion no longer mattered to me. The photograph of the villa glowed on my phone screen as evening deepened into night. Somewhere across an ocean and a continent, that property waited. It represented freedom, independence, and the concrete proof that I had built something extraordinary without needing anything from the people who had spent decades demonstrating that I was not worth their time. This birthday would indeed be different, but not in any way my family could anticipate or control. The Sterling family estate in Paradise Valley had always functioned as a physical manifestation of my parents' values and priorities. Situated on 3 acres of meticulously maintained grounds, the property featured architecture that made bold statements about wealth, taste, and social position. Every element had been selected to impress visitors and reinforce the family's status within the community's upper echelons. The circular driveway could accommodate a dozen luxury vehicles during the frequent gatherings my parents hosted for business associates and social connections. The formal gardens required a full-time staff to maintain their magazine-worthy appearance. The interior design changed every few years to reflect current trends in high-end residential aesthetics. I had lived in that house until completing my graduate degree, occupying a bedroom on the 2nd floor that overlooked the pool area and guest house. My room had been adequate in size and amenities, but it had never felt like a space that belonged to me in any meaningful sense. My mother had selected the furniture, the color palette, the window treatments. When I attempted to personalize the space with posters or decorations that reflected my actual interests, she would remove them during her periodic inspections, explaining that the house needed to maintain certain aesthetic standards in case important guests needed to use various rooms during events. The contrast between my room and Victoria's suite was impossible to ignore. She occupied the entire east wing of the 2nd floor, with a bedroom, sitting area, private bathroom, and walk-in closet that resembled a small boutique. Her spaces were redecorated whenever she expressed interest in a new style or color scheme. She had input on furniture selection, artwork placement, and every detail of how her private areas looked and functioned. My parents treated her preferences as important design considerations worthy of professional consultation and significant financial investment. This pattern extended far beyond bedroom assignments. Victoria's education had been treated as the family's primary investment in future returns. She attended an elite private academy where tuition exceeded what many families spent on housing. My parents hired private tutors to ensure she excelled in subjects that would strengthen her applications to prestigious universities. They funded international travel experiences that would distinguish her from other applicants. They cultivated relationships with admissions officers and made substantial donations to institutions where they wanted Victoria to be accepted. When Victoria was admitted to Stanford University, my parents hosted a celebration dinner for 50 guests at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. They gave speeches about their pride in her achievement and their confidence in her future contributions to the family legacy. They presented her with a new luxury vehicle as a graduation gift, explaining that she needed reliable transportation befitting a Stanford student. The evening cost more than most families earned in several months, and every detail was photographed for the family's social media presence and holiday card that year. My own educational path had been substantially different. I attended quality public schools that prepared me adequately but lacked the prestige and connections of Victoria's private academy. When I expressed interest in architecture and historic preservation, my parents suggested these were nice hobbies, but not serious career paths for someone from a family with significant resources and expectations. They encouraged me to consider more practical fields like business administration or finance, areas where family connections could facilitate advancement, and where my work would intersect more directly with sterling family interests. I persisted in pursuing my actual interests despite their lack of enthusiasm. I earned admission to Arizona State University's architecture program, based on my academic performance and portfolio work. My parents attended my high school graduation but left immediately after the ceremony to attend a fundraising gala, where Victoria was receiving an award for her volunteer work. There was no celebration dinner for my graduation, no expensive gift, no gathering of friends and family to mark the transition. My grandmother took me to lunch the following week and gave me a check to help with university expenses, along with a handwritten card expressing her pride in my determination to follow my own path. University years reinforced the pattern that had been established throughout childhood. Victoria's college experience was fully funded by our parents, who covered tuition, housing, living expenses, study abroad programs, and anything else she needed or wanted. They visited her regularly, attended her campus events, and maintained constant involvement in her academic and social life. They spoke frequently about their daughter at Stanford, working the university's name into conversations whenever possible, using her attendance there as evidence of the family's success in raising exceptional children. My university experience was substantially more independent. My parents provided minimal financial support, explaining that public university education was much less expensive than Stanford, and that I should be able to manage most expenses through part-time work and modest loans. I worked 20 to 30 hours weekly throughout my undergraduate years, balancing employment at an architectural firm with full-time course loads and the extensive project work required by my program. I lived in shared apartments with roommates to minimize housing costs. I learned to budget carefully, to prioritize expenses, to make decisions based on practical constraints rather than preferences. The financial pressure was difficult, but it taught me capabilities I would not have developed otherwise. I learned to negotiate with employers, to advocate for fair compensation, to recognize my own value in professional contexts. I learned to manage complex schedules, to maximize productivity during limited available time, to maintain focus despite exhaustion. I learned self-reliance not as an abstract principle, but as a daily practical necessity. These were skills Victoria never needed to develop because every resource was provided before she needed to request it. When I graduated with honors and was accepted into a competitive graduate program in architectural preservation, my parents sent a card. Not a celebratory dinner, not attendance at the graduation ceremony, not even a phone call. Just a card with a generic congratulations message and their signatures. My grandmother attended the ceremony, cheering loudly when my name was called and taking me to dinner afterward at my favorite restaurant. She gave me another check, larger this time, with instructions to use it for whatever I needed to support my graduate studies. She told me she was proud of what I had accomplished entirely through my own effort and determination. Graduate school continued the pattern of minimal family support and maximum personal responsibility. I secured a research assistantship that covered tuition and provided a small stipend, But I still worked additional hours as a consultant for local preservation projects to cover living expenses and begin building professional experience. The work was demanding and often exhausting, but it was also deeply engaging. I was learning from faculty who were leaders in their field, working on projects that contributed to preserving culturally significant structures, developing expertise that would distinguish me in a competitive professional landscape. Victoria completed her undergraduate degree and was immediately hired into a management training program at one of my father's business associates' companies. My parents celebrated with another elaborate dinner party, gave speeches about her bright future, and purchased a luxury condominium for her in a prestigious downtown development. They explained that she needed appropriate housing that reflected her professional position and family background. The condominium cost more than most people would spend on a house, and it was given to her outright as a gift rather than as a loan she would be expected to repay. During this same period, I was living in a small studio apartment in a neighborhood my parents would have considered unsuitable, working 50 to 60 hours weekly between my assistantship and consulting projects, and slowly paying down the modest loans I had needed to supplement inadequate family support. The contrast was not subtle, but I had long since stopped expecting equity or fairness in how resources were allocated within the Sterling family structure. By the time I completed my graduate degree at 28, I had accumulated professional experience that most people did not gain until several years after finishing their education. I had worked on preservation projects ranging from historic theaters to 19th-century commercial districts. I had published research papers on adaptive reuse strategies and sustainable restoration techniques. I had built a network of professional contacts based on my actual work rather than on family connections. I had developed a reputation for solving complex problems and delivering results that satisfied both preservation requirements and contemporary functionality needs. The consulting firm where I had worked throughout graduate school offered me a full-time position upon completion of my degree. The role came with a salary that seemed extraordinary compared to my student budget, though it was actually quite modest by Sterling family standards. My parents did not attend my graduate school graduation. Victoria had a work commitment that same weekend, and my parents decided that supporting her career obligations was more important than attending my ceremony. My grandmother attended, of course, and we celebrated with a quiet dinner where she asked detailed questions about my research and my plans for the future. I threw myself into professional work with intensity that concerned some of my colleagues. I accepted every challenging project, volunteered for assignments that others avoided, worked weekends and evenings to ensure exceptional results. Within 2 years, I was promoted to senior consultant. Within 4 years, I was leading major projects and mentoring junior staff. Within 6 years, I had established enough professional credibility to attract clients based on my own reputation rather than on the firm's brand. The work was fulfilling in ways that had nothing to do with family approval or recognition. I was preserving buildings that held cultural and historical significance for communities. I was solving complex problems that require both technical expertise and creative thinking. I was helping property owners understand that historic structures could be economically viable when thoughtfully adapted for contemporary use. Every completed project represented tangible evidence that my work mattered, that my skills had value, that I was building something meaningful regardless of whether my family noticed or cared. Financial stability came gradually but steadily. My salary increased with each promotion and each successful project. I lived below my means, saving significant portions of my income, rather than spending to match my professional position or family background. I invested carefully in diversified portfolios that emphasize long-term growth over short-term returns. I educated myself about real estate investment, tax optimization strategies, and wealth-building approaches that were available to someone with discipline and patience, even without inherited advantages. One investment in particular proved transformative. 4 years before my 34th birthday, I joined a small group of investors in acquiring and redeveloping a historic warehouse district that had fallen into disrepair. The project required substantial capital and involved significant risk, but the location was ideal, and the structures had excellent bones that could support adaptive reuse. I invested a substantial portion of my savings into this project, betting that my professional expertise in preservation and adaptive reuse would help ensure successful outcomes. The development process took 3 years and was frequently frustrating. We encountered unexpected structural challenges, complex zoning negotiations, and community concerns about gentrification and displacement. I served as the project's preservation consultant, ensuring that renovations maintained historical character while incorporating modern infrastructure and safety requirements. The role consumed enormous amounts of time and energy beyond my regular consulting work, but I believed in the project's potential and was determined to see it succeed. When the completed warehouse district attracted a major development corporation interested in acquiring the property, the returns exceeded even optimistic projections. The corporation valued the property substantially higher than our development costs, because we had created something that successfully bridged historical preservation and contemporary functionality. My share of the sale proceeds, combined with savings and investment returns accumulated over years of careful financial management, resulted in the $2.4 million sum that appeared in my account 6 weeks before my 34th birthday. That number represented more than financial security. It represented proof that I had built something substantial entirely through my own capabilities. Every dollar reflected work I had performed, decisions I had made, risks I had calculated and accepted, patience and discipline maintained over years when the outcome remained uncertain. The money carried no connection to sterling family resources or approval. It was entirely mine, earned through my own effort, available to use according to my own priorities and values. The villa purchase had been the first major decision I made with those resources. I had not sought advice from financial advisors or family members. I had not conducted extensive analysis weighing various alternative uses of the capital. I had simply recognized something I wanted, something that represented the life I wanted to create for myself, and I had acted decisively to acquire it. The purchase was not financially reckless despite what my parents would likely claim. The villa was in excellent condition, in a highly desirable location, and represented a reasonable use of available resources for someone with my financial position. But even if it had been somewhat impractical, it would still have been my decision to make with my own money earned through my own work. The 8 years of birthday silence had not been entirely passive on my part. Each year when the day passed without acknowledgement from my parents or Victoria, I made a deliberate choice not to confront them about it. I did not send messages asking why they had forgotten. I did not express hurt or disappointment. I simply noted the silence, accepted it as confirmation of their priorities, and focused my attention on building a life that did not require their validation. Some people who knew about the family dynamic suggested I was being passive or allowing mistreatment to continue unchallenged. But my silence was not weakness or acceptance. It was strategic withdrawal from a relationship structure that had never served my well-being. Every year they forgot my birthday, I became slightly less invested in seeking their approval. Every year that passed without recognition, I grew more confident in my ability to define success according to my own standards rather than theirs. By my 34th birthday, I had reached a point where their acknowledgement genuinely did not matter anymore. I was not hoping they would remember and feeling disappointed when they did not. I was not waiting for some gesture that would indicate I had finally earned their attention. I had moved beyond needing anything from them emotionally or practically. The villa purchase was not about proving anything to my family. It was about creating something for myself that reflected my own values and desires. Their sudden interest after seeing the social media post revealed something I had long suspected, but could now confirm absolutely. Their lack of attention over the years had not been about being busy or distracted. It had been about their assessment of my value within the family hierarchy. The moment I possessed something they wanted, something that could benefit them or enhance their own lives, I suddenly became worth their immediate attention and demands for family meetings and discussions about proper coordination. The recognition would have been painful if I had still been seeking their approval. But I had moved past that need years ago through the gradual process of building a life that worked on its own terms. Their messages and calls were not opening wounds. They were confirming that my understanding of the relationship dynamics had been accurate all along. They cared about what I could provide them, not about me as a person deserving of basic acknowledgement and respect. As my birthday evening concluded with 17 voicemails and messages archived without response, I felt something that might have seemed contradictory to outside observers. I felt grateful for those 8 years of silence. They had forced me to develop independence and self-reliance. They had prevented me from remaining entangled in family dynamics that would have limited my growth. They had created space for me to become someone who no longer needed their validation to feel successful or worthwhile. The villa across the ocean represented the culmination of that journey toward independence. But it also represented the beginning of something new. The active establishment of boundaries that protected the life I had built from people who had spent decades demonstrating they did not value my presence unless it served their interests. The family dinner they were demanding would become the setting where those boundaries were made absolutely clear. They thought my silence meant I was uncertain or guilty about my choices. They were about to learn that my silence had meant I was finally completely free. The week following my birthday post passed with a strange duality of experience. Professionally, I continued meeting with clients, reviewing preservation plans, and coordinating with contractors on active projects. The work proceeded with its usual demands and satisfactions, each day filled with the detailed problem-solving that made my career engaging. Personally, however, I existed in a state of deliberate suspension, watching my family's escalating attempts to reach me while maintaining complete silence on my end. My mother's messages evolved from demanding to concern to almost pleading over the course of those 7 days. The first few texts had carried the imperious tone I associated with her usual communication style, instructions rather than requests, assumptions that her priorities automatically superseded anyone else's schedule or boundaries. By the third day, her messages began incorporating phrases about worrying for my well-being, wondering if something was wrong, expressing confusion about why I was not responding to their attempts to connect. My father's approach was characteristically different. His messages remained formal and slightly threatening throughout the week, implying that my silence represented some form of disrespect or violation of family protocols. He sent articles about the complexities of international property ownership, the risks of making major financial decisions without proper consultation, the importance of family unity in managing significant assets. Each message carried the implicit suggestion that I had acted improperly, and that correction required immediate family intervention. Victoria's communications were perhaps the most revealing. Her early messages focused primarily on practical questions about the villa, asking about bedroom configurations, kitchen amenities, accessibility of the location for hosting events. She sent links to travel websites showing flights to Naples and Rome, asked about the best season to visit the Amalfi Coast, wondered aloud in her texts about how many people the property could comfortably accommodate. Her messages contained almost no acknowledgement that this was my property, my investment, my decision. She wrote as though the villa was a family asset that simply required coordination regarding usage schedules. By day 5, Victoria's tone shifted noticeably. She sent a longer message explaining that our parents were genuinely concerned about my silence, that everyone was worried something serious might be wrong, that family meant supporting each other during important life decisions. She suggested that my lack of communication was causing unnecessary stress for everyone, and that a simple conversation would resolve whatever misunderstanding had developed. The message positioned my silence as the problem rather than their years of neglect or their current presumptuous demands. I read each message as it arrived but responded to none of them. The silence was not punitive, though I understood they likely experienced it that way. It was protective. I needed time to process what their sudden attention revealed about our relationship dynamics, and to determine how I wanted to proceed. Responding immediately would have meant reacting from emotion rather than acting from clarity, and I had learned through years of professional negotiation that reactions rarely produced optimal outcomes. My grandmother called on the third day after my birthday. Unlike my parents and sister, she did not demand explanations or express concern about my investment decisions. She asked how I was feeling, whether I was enjoying the satisfaction of having acquired something so beautiful, what my plans were for eventually visiting the property. We talked for over an hour about my vision for the villa, the preservation work that had been completed, the history of the region and its architectural traditions. She asked thoughtful questions and listened to my answers with genuine interest. Near the end of our conversation, my grandmother mentioned that my mother had contacted her, looking for insight into why I was not responding to family messages. My grandmother said she had told my mother that perhaps I was busy with work and would respond when my schedule allowed. Then she added something that stayed with me through the remainder of that week. She said that sometimes the people who give us the least are the most offended when we stop offering them everything. That observation crystallized something I had been circling around without quite articulating. My family's anger about my silence was not really about concern for my well-being or desire to offer support. It was about their expectation that I would remain perpetually available to them despite years of demonstrating that my presence in their lives held minimal value. They expected access without reciprocity, attention without investment, availability without acknowledgement. The villa purchase had disrupted that arrangement by making me suddenly interesting to them, and my silence was refusing to accept the terms under which they wanted to re-engage. On day 6, my mother left a voicemail that departed significantly from her previous messages. Her voice carried none of its usual composed authority. She sounded uncertain, almost fragile, as she said that the family was planning a dinner for the following evening, and that my presence was essential. She said there were important matters to discuss regarding family assets and future planning. She said she hoped I would set aside whatever was causing my current distance and join them for this important conversation. The message ended with something she had not said to me in years. She said she loved me and hoped to see me soon. I listened to that voicemail 3 times, analyzing the shift in approach and considering what it revealed about their growing desperation to secure my response. The mention of family assets and future planning suggested they had developed some narrative about the villa that positioned it as relevant to broader Sterling family interests. The declaration of love felt performative rather than authentic, a strategic addition meant to elicit the response that demands and implications had failed to produce. That evening, I made a decision about how to proceed. I would attend the dinner they were so insistent on arranging, but I would do so on my own terms and with absolute clarity about the boundaries I intended to establish. I composed a brief message and sent it to the family group chat that had been silent on my end for the entire week. The message said simply that I would attend dinner the following evening at 7, and that I looked forward to our conversation. I included no explanations, no acknowledgments of their previous messages, no indication of what I was thinking or planning. The response was immediate. My mother replied within minutes, expressing relief that I would be joining them and confirming the time. My father sent a message saying he was glad I was being reasonable about this situation. Victoria sent several texts about how good it would be to see me, and how much easier everything would be once we could all talk openly. Their messages revealed their assumption that my agreement to attend meant capitulation, that I was coming to the dinner ready to accept whatever plans they had developed regarding the villa. That assumption would prove incorrect, but I saw no benefit in correcting it before the dinner itself. Let them believe my attendance signaled acquiescence. Let them prepare their arguments and rehearse their presentations about how the villa could serve family interests. Their expectations would make the actual conversation more clarifying for everyone involved. The day of the dinner, I approached my work with unusual focus, using the demands of client meetings and project reviews to maintain equilibrium. I met with a property owner who was considering adaptive reuse options for a historic hotel building, walked through the structure identifying preservation opportunities and functional constraints, outlined preliminary recommendations for how the space could be transformed while maintaining its architectural character. The work required the kind of detailed attention that left no room for distraction or anxiety about the evening ahead. In late afternoon, I returned to my apartment and spent time selecting what to wear to the dinner. The choice was more strategic than aesthetic. I wanted to present myself in a way that communicated professional success and personal confidence, without appearing to seek approval or validation. I chose a tailored blazer and elegant trousers in neutral tones, paired with simple jewelry that suggested refined taste without ostentation. The overall effect was polished and self-assured, someone comfortable in her own authority. I arrived at the Sterling estate at precisely 7 o'clock. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting warm light across the carefully maintained grounds. Several luxury vehicles were already parked in the circular driveway, indicating that this was not the small family dinner the invitation had implied. My parents had apparently decided that whatever conversation they planned required witnesses or supporters beyond the immediate family. My father opened the door before I reached it, his expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was working to control whatever he was actually feeling. He greeted me with formal politeness and gestured toward the formal dining room, where I could hear conversation already in progress. As I walked through the familiar hallways, I noted that the house had been recently redecorated again, The color palette shifted from the warm tones I remembered to cooler grays and whites that reflected current design trends in luxury residential spaces. The dining room contained more people than I had anticipated. My parents and Victoria were present as expected, but they had also invited Victoria's husband Marcus, my Uncle James who managed some of the family's real estate investments, and my Aunt Patricia who had married into the family and had always seemed more interested in social positioning than in actual relationships. The group fell silent as I entered, all eyes turning toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to calculation. My mother stood and moved toward me with outstretched arms, attempting to initiate an embrace I had not agreed to and did not want. I stepped back slightly, maintaining physical distance while offering a polite greeting that acknowledged her presence without accepting the false intimacy she was attempting to establish. The moment was brief but awkward, and I saw my mother's expression flicker with something that might have been hurt before she recovered her composed demeanor. We moved toward the table, where place settings indicated careful thought about positioning. I was seated between my Uncle James and my Aunt Patricia, with my parents at the head and foot of the table and Victoria and Marcus across from me. The arrangement was clearly designed to make me feel surrounded, observed from multiple angles, subject to coordinated questioning or pressure. It was the same strategic seating approach my father used in business negotiations, when he wanted to create psychological disadvantage for the person he was negotiating against. Dinner service began with small talk that felt forced and performative. My Aunt Patricia asked generic questions about my work, displaying no genuine interest in the answers. My Uncle James made observations about the local real estate market, clearly working toward some point he intended to make later. Victoria talked about recent developments at her workplace, stories carefully selected to emphasize her success and professional advancement. My parents orchestrated the conversation like conductors leading an orchestra, guiding topics and managing pacing toward some predetermined destination. The meal itself was elaborate, the kind of multi-course presentation my mother favored when she wanted to emphasize the family's sophistication and resources. Each course was explained by the serving staff, the ingredients and preparation methods described with the solemnity usually reserved for fine art. Wine was poured and praised, pairings discussed, vintage years mentioned as though they held significance beyond pretension. The entire production was designed to create atmosphere and context for whatever conversation would follow once the performance of elegant dining concluded. I participated in the required social rituals with practiced ease, making appropriate comments and asking polite questions while revealing nothing of substance about my thoughts or intentions. I had attended enough of these dinners over the years to understand the unspoken rules and expectations. The actual purpose of the gathering would not be addressed until dessert had been served and the staff had been dismissed, creating the privacy my family preferred for discussions they did not want witnessed by employees. As the final course was cleared and coffee was offered, my father assumed his characteristic position of authority, leaning forward slightly with his hands folded on the table in front of him. He began by thanking everyone for attending this important family dinner, and expressing his pleasure at having me present for a conversation that affected everyone at the table. The framing was immediate and deliberate, positioning whatever followed as a family matter rather than something that concerned me alone. He continued by acknowledging that I had made a significant investment in international property, describing the villa in terms that emphasized its value while subtly questioning the wisdom of the purchase. He noted that real estate investments, particularly in foreign countries, carried complexities and risks that required careful consideration and expert guidance. He said that as a family with substantial real estate holdings and expertise, the Sterlings had resources and knowledge that could have been beneficial during my decision-making process. My mother interjected with her own prepared comments, speaking about family as a source of support and guidance during major life decisions. She said that isolation was never beneficial, that the strongest families made important choices collaboratively, considering how individual decisions affected the broader family unit. She expressed concern that I had undertaken something so significant without seeking input or advice from people who cared about my well-being and wanted to help me succeed. Victoria added her perspective, talking about how the villa represented an opportunity for the entire family to benefit from my investment. She described her vision for how the property could be used for family gatherings, celebrations, and retreats that would strengthen relationships and create lasting memories. She suggested that by opening the villa to family use, I would be demonstrating the generous spirit and collaborative mindset that define the Sterling family values. My Uncle James provided the financial perspective, explaining that international properties required ongoing maintenance and management that could be burdensome for a single owner. He suggested that establishing some form of family partnership or shared ownership structure would distribute responsibilities and costs while ensuring the property received proper attention. He had clearly prepared this suggestion in advance, as he produced documents outlining potential legal structures for converting my individual ownership into some form of family trust or limited partnership. Throughout these presentations, I remained silent, listening carefully to each person's contribution and noting the coordination evident in their approach. They had planned this intervention thoroughly, assigning each person a specific angle to emphasize, building toward a conclusion they had predetermined before I even arrived. The entire dinner had been staged to pressure me into agreeing to transform my personal property into a family asset, to surrender the independence the villa represented in exchange for acceptance back into family structures I had never truly belonged to. When they had all finished their prepared remarks, my father looked at me expectantly and asked for my thoughts on what had been presented. The room fell silent, everyone waiting for my response. This was the moment they had orchestrated, the point at which they expected me to feel overwhelmed by their united front and grateful for their willingness to help me manage something they had decided was too complex for me to handle alone. I took a slow sip of coffee, set the cup down carefully, and met my father's eyes across the table. Then I did something none of them anticipated. I smiled. Not a warm or friendly expression, but something cooler and more knowing. The smile of someone who had just watched an elaborate performance and was about to reveal that she had seen through every calculated moment. The silence stretched as they waited for me to speak, their expressions shifting from expectant to uncertain. They had assumed my silence throughout the week meant confusion or guilt. They were about to discover that my silence had meant something entirely different. I had been preparing, calculating, and determining exactly how to establish boundaries they could not misunderstand or dismiss. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and absolutely clear. I thanked them for the dinner and for their presentations. Then I explained that we needed to have a very different conversation than the one they had planned, a conversation about boundaries, respect, and the reality of our relationships. The villa was mine, I said, purchased with money I had earned independently through work they had never valued or acknowledged. And there would be no family partnership, no shared usage, no transformation of my personal property into something that served their interests. The expressions around the table shifted from confusion to shock, as they began to understand that this evening was not proceeding according to their script. I was not the grateful daughter seeking family approval. I was someone who had finally decided to speak the truth they had spent years avoiding. The silence that followed my opening statement stretched across the dining room like a physical presence. Every person at the table seemed frozen in the moment between expectation and understanding, their minds still processing that the evening was not unfolding according to their carefully orchestrated script. My father's expression shifted from confident authority to something harder to read, a tightening around his eyes that suggested he was recalculating his approach. My mother's hand had moved to her chest in a gesture I recognized from years of observation, as her physical tell when situations moved beyond her control. I continued speaking before anyone could interrupt or attempt to redirect the conversation back toward their preferred narrative. I explained that I appreciated their sudden interest in my life and my decisions, but that I found the timing curious given that they had not acknowledged my birthday in 8 consecutive years. I said this without anger or accusation, simply stating observable facts that everyone at the table knew to be true but had apparently hoped would not be mentioned explicitly. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, likely to offer some explanation or justification, but I raised my hand in a gentle gesture requesting she wait. I was not finished, and I needed to complete my thoughts without interruption or deflection. She closed her mouth and sat back in her chair, exchanging glances with Marcus that suggested they were reassessing their understanding of how this evening would proceed. I continued by acknowledging that our family had always operated according to certain hierarchies and priorities. Victoria's achievements had been celebrated elaborately, while mine had been largely ignored. Victoria's needs had been anticipated and met with abundant resources while mine had been addressed minimally or not at all. This was not a complaint, I explained, but simply an accurate description of how our family had functioned throughout my entire life. I had accepted these patterns years ago, and had built a life that did not depend on changing them. My Uncle James attempted to interject, suggesting that I was mischaracterizing family dynamics, and that perhaps I had simply not communicated my needs clearly enough. I turned to face him directly and asked a simple question. Could he remember the last time he had acknowledged my birthday without prompting? Could he recall a single significant achievement of mine that the family had celebrated with anything approaching the enthusiasm they showed for Victoria's accomplishments? The questions were not rhetorical. I waited for his response. He struggled visibly to produce examples, his mouth opening and closing as he searched his memory for instances that would contradict my characterization. After several awkward seconds, he deflected, saying that he was not good with dates and that his poor memory did not reflect his feelings about family relationships. I nodded and suggested that perhaps that was precisely the point. When something matters to us, when someone matters to us, we make the effort to remember and to acknowledge. The failure to do so reveals priorities more clearly than any amount of retroactive justification. My Aunt Patricia spoke up, her tone carrying the artificial warmth she deployed in social situations when she wanted to appear caring while actually manipulating. She said that family relationships were complex, and that perhaps there had been misunderstandings on multiple sides. She suggested that the important thing was moving forward in a spirit of unity and mutual support, not dwelling on perceived slights from the past. She was attempting to position my accurate observations about years of neglect as my personal interpretation rather than as objective reality. I responded by agreeing that moving forward was indeed important, which was precisely why I needed to establish clear boundaries about how I would engage with family relationships going forward. The villa purchase represented something significant for me beyond its monetary value or its potential as a vacation property. It represented a milestone in becoming fully independent from family structures that had never adequately supported my development or acknowledged my worth. I had purchased the property with money I earned entirely through my own professional efforts, and I intended to maintain it as a space that belonged exclusively to me. My father's composure cracked slightly, his voice rising as he said that I was being unreasonable, and that family meant sharing resources and supporting one another. I met his eyes steadily and asked him to explain what resources the family had shared with me over the past decade. What support had they provided during my graduate education? What assistance had they offered as I built my career? What acknowledgement had they given to the professional success I had achieved entirely through my own capabilities? The questions hung in the air unanswered because we all knew the answers. The family had provided minimal financial support during my education, requiring me to work extensively while Victoria's university experience was fully funded. They had offered no professional connections or assistance as I established my career, while Victoria had been immediately placed in a prestigious position through family relationships. They had acknowledged none of my achievements while celebrating Victoria's most minor accomplishments with elaborate gatherings and expensive gifts. My mother's voice cracked with emotion as she said that she loved both her daughters equally, and that it hurt her to hear me suggest otherwise. I responded gently but firmly that love expressed through actions carries more weight than love claimed through words. I did not doubt that she felt some form of affection for me, but the evidence of 8 years without birthday acknowledgments, decades of differential treatment, and a lifetime of making clear through countless small decisions that Victoria's needs and achievements mattered more than mine suggested that whatever she felt did not translate into the kind of consistent attention and support that characterizes genuine parental investment. Victoria finally found her voice, saying that I was being unfair, and that she had not created the family dynamics I was describing. I agreed immediately. She had not created these patterns. She had simply been the beneficiary of them while I had been the one overlooked. That was not her fault, but it was her reality and mine, and pretending otherwise served no purpose. I said this without hostility, simply acknowledging the structural reality of how our parents had chosen to allocate their attention and resources between their 2 daughters. Marcus, Victoria's husband, spoke for the first time, suggesting that perhaps we were all saying things in the heat of the moment that we did not truly mean, and that it might be better to postpone this conversation until everyone had time to calm down. I turned to him and explained that I was not speaking from emotion or heat. I had spent the entire week since posting about the villa considering exactly what I wanted to say, and how I wanted to say it. Every word I had spoken this evening reflected careful thought about establishing boundaries that would protect the life I had built from people who had spent years demonstrating that they valued me only when I possessed something they wanted. My Uncle James returned to his earlier suggestion about establishing some form of shared ownership structure, arguing that it would be financially prudent and would help strengthen family bonds. I asked him directly whether he would have proposed such an arrangement if I had purchased a modest property that held no appeal for family vacations. Would he be sitting here advocating for shared ownership of a small apartment or an unremarkable house in an ordinary neighborhood? His silence answered the question more effectively than words could have. I explained that the villa represented freedom to me in ways that went beyond its physical beauty or its investment value. It represented a space where I could exist entirely on my own terms, where my presence did not depend on meeting anyone else's expectations or serving anyone else's needs, where I could simply be myself without the constant awareness that I was the less valued daughter in a family that had never quite figured out what to do with someone who did not fit their preferred narrative. My mother began crying, tears running down her carefully made-up face, her shoulders shaking with what appeared to be genuine distress. Part of me felt sympathy for her pain, but a larger part recognized this as a familiar pattern. When confronted with uncomfortable truths about her behavior or choices, my mother often responded with emotional displays that shifted attention from the substance of the criticism to her suffering in receiving it. The tears were real, but they functioned strategically whether she intended that or not, redirecting conversations away from accountability toward comforting her wounded feelings. I did not move to comfort her. I remained seated, allowing her emotional response to exist without accepting responsibility for managing it. My father moved to place his hand on her shoulder, glaring at me with an expression that blamed me for causing her distress. The dynamic was familiar from countless previous interactions where my attempts to address problematic patterns had been reframed as my failure to show appropriate sensitivity to my mother's feelings. Victoria asked quietly what I wanted from this conversation, what outcome I was hoping to achieve by detailing all the ways the family had failed me. It was a fair question, and I appreciated that she asked it directly rather than continuing to argue about my characterization of our family history. I told her that I wanted clarity and honesty about our relationships moving forward. I wanted everyone at this table to understand that I would not be sharing the villa as a family resource, that I would not be seeking or accepting their input on my life decisions, and that I would not be available for family obligations that existed solely to serve their needs while ignoring mine. I explained that this did not mean I was cutting off all contact or declaring some dramatic estrangement. I simply meant that I was establishing the boundaries I should have set years ago, boundaries that protected my independence and acknowledged the reality of how our relationships actually functioned rather than pretending they were something they had never been. If they wanted to build genuine relationships with me going forward, that possibility existed, but it would require effort and acknowledgement on their part, not just expectations that I would continue being available while receiving nothing meaningful in return. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made several people flinch. He said that I was being selfish and ungrateful, that I was rejecting the family that had given me every advantage, that I was making a mistake I would come to regret. His voice carried the tone of absolute authority he used in business negotiations when he wanted to intimidate someone into accepting his terms. He was attempting to make me feel guilty for refusing to surrender my property and my independence to people who had spent decades demonstrating they did not value me unless I served their purposes. I stood as well, maintaining steady eye contact, refusing to be diminished by his attempt at intimidation. I responded that gratitude was appropriate when someone gives you something valuable, but that I had received very little from this family beyond the basic obligations they were legally required to fulfill as parents. They had provided housing and food during my childhood, as parents must. They had contributed minimally to my education, far less than they had provided for Victoria. They had offered no emotional support, no encouragement, no consistent acknowledgement that I mattered. Gratitude for performing minimum obligations while playing favorites between children seemed unnecessary. The room erupted into overlapping voices, everyone attempting to speak at once. My Aunt Patricia was saying something about respect for elders. My Uncle James was arguing about family unity. Victoria was trying to suggest that we all needed to calm down. Marcus was agreeing with my father that I was being unreasonable. My mother was still crying, now saying that she had done her best and that no parent was perfect. The cacophony of voices all trying to deflect, defend, and reframe was overwhelming. I raised my voice slightly, not shouting but speaking with enough volume and authority to cut through the chaos. I said that I had one more thing to say, and then I would be leaving. The voices quieted, everyone turning to look at me with expressions ranging from anger to shock to something that might have been grudging respect for refusing to be cowed by their collective pressure. I reached into my bag and removed a folder I had prepared before coming to dinner. The folder contained documentation of the villa purchase, legal papers showing sole ownership in my name, and a letter from my attorney that I had commissioned specifically for this evening. I placed the folder on the table and explained its contents. The documents confirmed that the villa was my individual property with no obligations to any other party. The letter from my attorney stated that any attempts to access the property without my explicit permission would constitute trespassing and would be addressed through appropriate legal channels. I explained that I had taken these steps not because I anticipated needing legal protection from my family, but because I wanted absolute clarity about boundaries and expectations. The villa was mine. It would remain mine. There would be no shared ownership structure, no family usage schedules, no discussions about how to coordinate access. If I chose at some point in the future to invite individual family members to visit, that would be my choice made on my terms, not an obligation or expectation. My father began to speak, but I continued before he could gain momentum. I said that I understood this was not the outcome they had anticipated when they arranged this dinner. They had expected me to feel overwhelmed by their unified front, grateful for their sudden attention, willing to compromise my independence in exchange for acceptance back into family structures. That expectation revealed how little they understood about who I had become during all the years they were focused primarily on Victoria. I had spent the past decade building a career that commanded respect in my field. I had developed financial independence that freed me from needing their resources. I had cultivated relationships with people who valued me for who I was rather than for what I could provide them. I had created a life that worked on its own terms without requiring their approval or participation. The villa purchase was not a plea for attention or a bid for inclusion. It was a celebration of having reached a point where their opinion of me had become genuinely irrelevant to my sense of self-worth. Victoria stood and moved toward me, her expression softer than it had been throughout the evening. She said quietly that she did not want our relationship to become adversarial, and that she hoped we could find some way to maintain connection, even if I needed distance from our parents. I appreciated the gesture and told her honestly that I was open to building a healthier relationship with her, but that it would need to be based on genuine mutual interest rather than on family obligation or her desire to access my property. She nodded, seeming to understand and accept what I was offering. Our relationship had always been complicated by the differential treatment our parents provided, by the ways their favoritism had positioned us in implicit competition for limited parental attention and resources. Perhaps with some distance from those dynamics we could develop something more authentic, but that would depend on whether she was willing to acknowledge the structural inequities we had grown up with rather than pretending they did not exist. I picked up the folder from the table and returned it to my bag. I thanked my parents for the dinner, nodded to the others at the table, and turned toward the door. My mother called after me, asking when she would see me again, whether I was really planning to shut them out of my life completely. I paused and turned back, explaining that I was not shutting anyone out. I was simply establishing that engagement would happen on terms of mutual respect, rather than on their assumption of unlimited access to my time, attention, and resources regardless of how they treated me. I walked through the familiar hallways of the house where I had grown up, noting once again how little the space had ever felt like home. The elegant furnishings and carefully curated aesthetics had always been about impression management, rather than about creating an environment where all family members felt valued and welcomed. I had spent my childhood and young adulthood in these rooms feeling like a perpetual guest rather than a full family member, always aware that my presence was less important than Victoria's, less worthy of accommodation or attention. As I reached my car in the circular driveway, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see my father approaching, his expression difficult to read in the fading light. For a moment I thought he might be coming to continue arguing, to make one final attempt at intimidation or manipulation. Instead, He stopped several feet away and said something I had not anticipated. He said that he recognized I had become someone he had not expected, someone more independent and self-sufficient than he had given me credit for. The statement was not quite an apology or an acknowledgement of past failures, but it represented more honesty than I had heard from him in years. I thanked him for saying that and added that I hoped he could come to understand that independence was not the same as rejection, that my establishment of boundaries reflected strength rather than hostility, that creating a life that worked for me did not mean I was attacking the life they had built for themselves. Whether he could understand those distinctions remained to be seen, but at least the statement had been made clearly. I drove away from the Sterling estate as the sun completed its descent below the horizon, watching the house recede in my rearview mirror. The evening had been difficult but necessary, a public establishment of boundaries that had been years in development. They had expected capitulation and had received declaration instead. They had anticipated that their sudden attention would make me grateful and compliant, and they had discovered that I had moved far beyond needing their approval. The villa across the ocean waited, representing freedom and independence in tangible form. But the real liberation had happened tonight, in my refusal to accept their narrative about family obligations and shared resources, in my clear statement that I would no longer participate in relationships structured around my availability to serve their needs while mine were perpetually minimized or ignored. The truth had been spoken. The boundaries had been established. Whatever came next would unfold on fundamentally different terms than anything that had come before. The morning after the dinner at my parents' estate arrived with a quality of light that seemed different somehow, as though the act of speaking truth had altered my perception of even ordinary things like sunrise through bedroom windows. I woke without the alarm, my mind already active and processing the events of the previous evening. The conversation had unfolded almost exactly as I had anticipated, yet experiencing it had still carried emotional weight that I had not fully predicted. Speaking clearly about years of differential treatment and neglect had been simultaneously liberating and exhausting. I spent the first hour of the day in deliberate stillness, sitting with coffee on my small balcony, and watching the city emerge into morning activity. The sounds of traffic building, the movement of people beginning their daily routines, the gradual transition from quiet darkness to busy daylight created a familiar rhythm that grounded me after the intensity of confronting my family. I had spoken words that could not be unspoken, established boundaries that could not be easily dissolved, and changed the fundamental terms of relationships that had persisted unchanged for decades. My phone displayed several new messages when I finally checked it. Victoria had sent a text in the early morning hours, thanking me for my honesty even though it had been difficult to hear, and suggesting we meet for coffee when I felt ready to talk more casually. Her message carried none of the presumption or entitlement that had characterized her communications immediately after I posted about the villa. She seemed to have understood something significant had shifted, and that rebuilding any relationship between us would require acknowledging realities we had both previously avoided addressing directly. My mother's message was longer and more complicated. She wrote that she had spent the night thinking about what I had said, that she was hurt by some of my characterizations but was trying to understand my perspective, and that she hoped we could eventually work through these issues as a family. The message walked a careful line between accepting some responsibility and defending her choices, between expressing desire for reconciliation and maintaining that I had misunderstood or exaggerated certain aspects of family dynamics. It was neither a full acknowledgement nor a complete deflection, but rather something uncomfortably in between. My father had not sent any messages. That absence was consistent with his personality and his approach to conflict. He typically withdrew after confrontations, creating distance while he processed what had occurred and determined how to reassert control or authority in whatever came next. The silence from him was not surprising, though I noted it as information about how he was responding to having his expectations so thoroughly contradicted. I responded briefly to Victoria, agreeing that we should meet when schedules allowed and thanking her for her message. I did not respond to my mother immediately, needing more time to consider what I wanted to say, and whether engaging in written conversation about complex family dynamics would be productive, or would simply create more opportunities for misunderstanding and defensive reactions. Sometimes silence communicated more effectively than words, allowing space for genuine reflection, rather than immediate reactive exchange. The work week that followed the dinner became a period of surprising productivity and focus. I had anticipated that the emotional intensity of confronting my family might leave me distracted or unsettled, but instead I found myself working with unusual clarity and purpose. It was as though establishing those boundaries had freed mental and emotional energy that had been consumed by the unresolved tensions of family relationships. The work that filled my days demanded full attention and delivered immediate feedback about whether approaches were effective, creating satisfying contrast to the ambiguous and slow-moving nature of family dynamics. I spent Monday meeting with a client who owned a deteriorating Art Deco theater building in downtown Phoenix. The structure had tremendous architectural significance, but had been vacant for years, and was rapidly approaching the point where restoration would become economically prohibitive. We walked through the building together, my flashlight illuminating details that decades of neglect had obscured beneath grime and water damage. The ornate plasterwork, the elegant proportions of the main auditorium, the craftsmanship evident in every design element spoke to an era when public buildings were constructed as cultural monuments rather than as purely functional spaces. I outlined for the owner what restoration would require, and what the building could become with thoughtful adaptive reuse. The main theater space could be restored for live performance while the auxiliary spaces could be converted to rehearsal studios, gallery areas, and small commercial tenants that would generate revenue to support ongoing operations. The project would be complex and expensive, but it would preserve an irreplaceable piece of local architectural heritage while creating a viable contemporary use. By the end of our meeting, the owner had authorized me to develop a comprehensive preservation and adaptive reuse plan. Tuesday brought meetings with municipal planning officials regarding another project, a historic warehouse district where zoning changes were needed to permit the mixed-use development that would make preservation economically feasible. These meetings require patience and diplomatic persistence, navigating the competing interests of preservation advocates, neighborhood groups concerned about gentrification, and economic development officials focused on tax revenue and job creation. I had learned through years of experience how to build coalitions among groups with different priorities, identifying common ground and demonstrating how thoughtful preservation could serve multiple objectives simultaneously. Wednesday I spent primarily in my office, working through technical specifications and cost estimates for several active projects. The detailed work of calculating structural requirements, researching appropriate materials for historic restoration, and coordinating with contractors and specialized craftspeople required sustained concentration. I found the precision of this work deeply satisfying, the way clear technical requirements and buildable solutions emerged from careful analysis and systematic problem-solving. There was no ambiguity about whether approaches were correct or adequate. The building either stood safely or it did not. The restoration either honored the original design or it failed to do so. Thursday brought an unexpected development that would have significant implications for my professional trajectory. I received a call from the executive director of a national historic preservation organization, someone I knew by reputation but had never worked with directly. She explained that she had been following my recent projects through industry publications and through conversations with colleagues who had worked with me. She was impressed by my approach to making preservation economically viable through creative adaptive reuse strategies, and by my ability to navigate the complex political and regulatory environments that preservation projects inevitably encountered. The organization was launching a new initiative focused on developing replicable models for preserving endangered historic properties in mid-sized cities across the country. They were seeking a small number of consulting partners who could bring technical expertise, practical experience, and creative problem-solving abilities to help develop and refine these models. Would I be interested in discussing a potential partnership that would involve working on demonstration projects in multiple cities, while also developing training materials and best practices documentation that could be shared widely with preservation professionals? The opportunity she was describing aligned perfectly with my professional interests and would represent a significant expansion of my work beyond the regional focus that had characterized my career thus far. I would be contributing to preservation efforts nationally, while helping to develop approaches that could be implemented by communities lacking access to specialized expertise. The work would be challenging and would require substantial time commitment, but it represented exactly the kind of meaningful impact I had hoped to achieve when I first chose to focus on historic preservation and adaptive reuse. I scheduled a follow-up conversation for the following week to discuss details about scope, timeline, and partnership structure. After ending the call, I sat for several minutes absorbing what this opportunity might mean. My career had been built through steady accumulation of successful projects and professional relationships, each accomplishment creating foundation for the next level of responsibility and influence. This invitation to participate in a national initiative represented recognition that my work had achieved a level of quality and innovation that warranted broader platform and greater responsibility. The timing felt significant. In the same week that I had definitively established independence from family structures that had never adequately valued my capabilities or achievements, I was receiving professional recognition that validated everything I had built through my own efforts. The contrast was not lost on me. My family had finally noticed my existence when I acquired something they wanted, but my professional community was inviting me into important work because they respected what I had accomplished and believed I had meaningful contributions to offer. Friday afternoon, I met Victoria for coffee at a cafe near my office. She arrived precisely on time, looking somewhat uncertain in ways that were uncharacteristic for someone usually so confident in social situations. We ordered drinks and found a quiet table away from the main traffic flow, creating space for conversation that would require more privacy and honesty than casual cafe interaction typically demanded. Victoria began by apologizing for her initial response to my villa purchase, acknowledging that she had immediately thought about how the property could benefit her without considering that it represented something important and personal for me. She said the dinner at our parents' house had been difficult but had forced her to recognize patterns in how our family operated that she had benefited from without fully acknowledging. She had always known on some level that our parents treated us differently, but she had not allowed herself to examine that reality directly or to consider what it meant for our relationship as sisters. I appreciated her willingness to engage honestly rather than deflecting or minimizing. I explained that my goal in establishing boundaries was not to punish anyone or to create permanent estrangement, but rather to protect the independence I had worked hard to achieve and to stop participating in relationship patterns that had always been fundamentally unbalanced. I did not need her to feel guilty about having been the favored child. She had not created those dynamics. But I did need her to acknowledge that they existed and had real consequences for both of us, shaping our experiences and our relationship in ways we were only now beginning to address directly. We talked for over 2 hours, conversation moving between difficult acknowledgments of past patterns and tentative exploration of how we might build something different going forward. Victoria shared experiences from her own perspective that I had not fully considered, ways that being the favored child had created its own pressures and constraints. Our parents' constant attention and high expectations had sometimes felt suffocating, leaving her uncertain about which of her achievements reflected genuine capability versus advantages provided through family resources and connections. I had not previously thought about the psychological burden of receiving abundant support and advantages, while knowing that a sibling was receiving far less. Victoria said she had often felt guilty about the differential treatment, but had not known how to address it without seeming ungrateful for advantages she had not requested but had certainly benefited from. The guilt had led her to avoid thinking about the disparity too directly, accepting our parents' implicit message that Victoria simply needed and deserved more because she was accomplishing more. A circular logic that justified unequal treatment, while ignoring how that treatment itself created unequal opportunities. Our conversation did not resolve decades of complicated family dynamics, or instantly transform our relationship into something uncomplicated and easy. But it represented a beginning, a mutual acknowledgement that the patterns we had grown up with had been neither healthy nor fair, and a shared willingness to explore whether we could develop a relationship based on genuine connection, rather than on our assigned roles within family hierarchy. We agreed to meet regularly, to continue these conversations, and to be honest with each other even when honesty was uncomfortable. As Victoria prepared to leave, she mentioned that our parents were struggling with how to respond to what had happened at the dinner. My father was angry and wanted to take a hard line, treating my boundary setting as defiance that required consequences. My mother was more conflicted, wanting to repair the relationship but uncertain about whether that required acknowledging wrongdoing, or whether she could simply wait for time to soften my position. Victoria said she had tried to explain to them that I was not negotiating or bluffing, that the boundaries I had established were serious and permanent unless they were willing to fundamentally change how they engaged with me. I thanked her for attempting to help them understand, while noting that their response was ultimately their choice to make. I had stated my position clearly. I would not compromise my independence or my property to purchase acceptance from people who had spent decades demonstrating that my value to them was conditional on my willingness to accept minimized status. If they want a genuine relationship with me, the terms for that had been clearly communicated. If they preferred to maintain their anger about not being able to access and control what I had built, that was their prerogative, but it would be their choice that prevented connection, not mine. The week concluded with me spending Saturday in my apartment, handling the ordinary tasks of laundry and cleaning and meal preparation that had been neglected during a professionally intense week. The mundane activities created space for continued processing of everything that had shifted in my relationship with my family. I had spoken truths that had needed saying for years. I had established boundaries that protected what I had built. I had begun what might become a healthier relationship with my sister. And I had received professional recognition that validated my work in ways that had nothing to do with family name or connections. Sunday morning my grandmother called, asking if she could take me to brunch. We met at a restaurant she favored, a quiet place with excellent food and an atmosphere conducive to real conversation. Over eggs and fresh fruit, she asked how I was feeling after what she understood had been a difficult family dinner. Victoria had apparently given her some sense of what had transpired, though my grandmother wanted to hear my perspective directly. I walked her through the evening, describing both what I had said and how others had responded. My grandmother listened without interrupting, her expression reflecting understanding and something that looked like pride. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. She said that watching me establish boundaries she had never managed to set with my parents made her both happy and somewhat sad. Happy because I was protecting myself in ways she had not adequately protected me during my childhood and adolescence. Sad because she recognized that her own inability to confront my parents about their differential treatment had allowed patterns to persist unchallenged for too long. I assured her that I did not hold her responsible for my parents' choices about how to treat their children. She had been the one source of consistent support and acknowledgement throughout my life, the one person who had made me feel valued regardless of how I compared to Victoria. Her presence had been essential in helping me develop enough sense of self-worth to eventually establish the boundaries I had just set. Without her steady validation during all those years when my parents were focused elsewhere, I might not have possessed the confidence to claim my independence so definitively. We talked about the villa and about my plans for eventually spending extended time there. My grandmother said she hoped I would invite her to visit once I had settled in, that she would love to see the place that represented such an important milestone in my journey toward full independence. I promised that she would be among my first guests, that I would be honored to share that space with the one family member who had consistently demonstrated that my presence in her life mattered. As we left the restaurant, my grandmother took my hand and said something I would remember during challenging moments that would inevitably come. She said that the people who truly love us celebrate our independence rather than resenting it, that genuine family relationships expand with our growth, rather than demanding we remain small to accommodate others' need for control. The villa was not just a beautiful property. It was a physical manifestation of my refusal to remain small, and that refusal was something to be celebrated rather than something requiring apology or justification. The week had been transformative in ways both subtle and profound. I had spoken truth, established boundaries, begun rebuilding one relationship while accepting the limitations of others, and received professional recognition that validated my life's work. The path forward remained uncertain in some ways, but it was a path I would walk on my own terms, with clarity about my worth and determination to protect the independence I had fought so hard to achieve. The weeks following my establishment of boundaries with my family settled into a rhythm that felt simultaneously unfamiliar and deeply right. Professional obligations continued to fill my days with the satisfying complexity of preservation work, each project presenting unique challenges that required creative problem-solving and meticulous attention to historical integrity. The work itself had not changed, but my relationship to it had somehow deepened. Without the background noise of unresolved family tensions consuming mental and emotional energy, I found myself engaging with projects with a focus and creativity that produced results even I had not anticipated achieving. The National Historic Preservation Organization's initiative moved forward with encouraging momentum. I participated in several planning conferences via video connection, meeting the other consulting partners who would be contributing expertise to the demonstration projects. The group included architects, urban planners, economic development specialists, and preservation advocates from across the country, each bringing distinct perspectives and capabilities to the collective effort. The conversations were intellectually stimulating and practically grounded, focusing on how to develop approaches that could be replicated by communities with limited resources and expertise. My specific role within the initiative centered on developing case studies and methodologies for adaptive reuse of historic commercial and industrial structures. The work would involve identifying buildings in various cities that represented both preservation opportunities and economic development potential, then creating detailed plans demonstrating how these structures could be transformed into viable contemporary uses while maintaining their historical character and cultural significance. The case studies would become resources for local preservation groups, municipal planning departments, and community development organizations attempting similar projects in their own regions. The first demonstration project site was located in a mid-sized city in Ohio, a former manufacturing center that had experienced significant economic decline as industries relocated or closed entirely. The downtown area contained numerous historic buildings constructed during the city's prosperity in the early 20th century, many now vacant or severely underutilized. The buildings represented excellent examples of commercial and industrial architecture from that era, but decades of deferred maintenance had created substantial preservation challenges. I traveled to Ohio on a cold morning in late autumn, the landscape transitioning from the southwestern desert I called home to the deciduous forests and rolling terrain of the Midwest. The city revealed itself gradually as I drove from the airport toward the downtown area, neighborhoods displaying varying degrees of vitality and decline, the physical evidence of economic transformation written across the built environment. The downtown core contained the concentrated collection of historic structures that would be the focus of our preservation initiative. The local preservation society had arranged a walking tour of the most significant buildings, led by volunteers who had been documenting and advocating for these structures for years with minimal resources and limited success. Their passion for the buildings and their frustration with the challenges of preservation in economically struggling communities was immediately evident. They spoke about each structure not just as an architectural artifact, but as a repository of community memory and cultural identity, places that connected current residents to the city's history and to the generations who had built and sustained these institutions. We spent hours walking through cold buildings with intermittent heat and electricity, my flashlight illuminating architectural details that decades of neglect had obscured but not destroyed. Ornate terracotta facades, elegant interior spaces with soaring ceilings and natural light, evidence of craftsmanship and design sensibility that contemporary construction rarely attempted to match. Each building told stories about the community's past while also presenting specific technical challenges regarding structural integrity, building systems, and code compliance that would need to be addressed in any preservation plan. The most promising candidate for the demonstration project was a former department store building, occupying an entire city block. The structure featured a cast-iron facade with large display windows on the ground floor and upper stories with elaborate brickwork and decorative elements. The interior contained a magnificent central atrium that had been covered during a misguided renovation decades earlier, but remained intact beneath suspended ceiling tiles. The building had been vacant for 15 years, long enough for significant deterioration but not so long that preservation had become impossibly expensive. I spent 2 full days documenting the building's condition, photographing every significant architectural element, reviewing what historical records existed regarding original construction and subsequent modifications, and consulting with local contractors about costs and availability of specialized craftspeople capable of executing historically appropriate restoration work. The analysis would form the foundation for a comprehensive preservation and adaptive reuse plan demonstrating how the building could be transformed into mixed-use space containing retail, office, and residential units, while maintaining its architectural character and contributing to downtown revitalization. The work was consuming in the best possible way, requiring complete attention and delivering immediate feedback about whether approaches were technically sound and economically viable. During those days in Ohio, I barely thought about my family or about the villa or about any of the personal complexities that had dominated my thoughts in recent weeks. The preservation work created productive space where my value was determined entirely by the quality of analysis and the feasibility of solutions I developed, not by my position within family hierarchies or my willingness to sacrifice independence for acceptance. Evenings in the modest hotel where I stayed provided quiet time for processing the day's observations and beginning to sketch preliminary concepts for how the department store building might be adaptively reused. I worked at the small desk in my room, drawings and notes spreading across available surfaces as ideas developed and evolved. The design challenge required balancing multiple competing objectives, preserving architecturally significant elements, creating economically viable contemporary spaces, meeting current building codes and accessibility requirements, and demonstrating approaches that could be replicated in similar projects elsewhere. The preliminary concept that emerged centered on revealing and restoring the central atrium as the organizing element of the entire building. The atrium would become a dramatic public space connecting all levels and uses, with natural light filtering down from a restored skylight that had been covered during previous renovations. Ground floor retail spaces would maintain their street presence while opening onto the atrium, creating visual connection and circulation between public sidewalks and interior commercial activity. Upper floors would contain a combination of office spaces and residential units, each designed to maximize the building's architectural assets while providing functional contemporary environments. The approach prioritized preservation of significant architectural elements while making necessary modifications to support viable contemporary uses. Original facades would be restored to their historical appearance. Interior spaces would maintain the generous ceiling heights and natural light that characterized early 20th century commercial architecture. Modern building systems would be integrated in ways that minimize visual impact on historic spaces. The goal was not to create a museum or to freeze the building in its original state, but rather to demonstrate how historic structures could evolve and adapt, while maintaining the architectural character that made them culturally significant. I returned to Phoenix after 5 days in Ohio with comprehensive documentation, preliminary design concepts, and renewed appreciation for how preservation work connected me to something larger than personal success or professional advancement. The buildings we were working to preserve represented tangible links to community history and cultural identity. The adaptive reuse strategies we were developing would help ensure that these connections endured, even as economic and social conditions changed. The work mattered in ways that transcended any individual project or professional achievement. The week following my return brought an unexpected communication from my father. He sent a brief email requesting that we meet for lunch to discuss what he termed a business opportunity that might be of mutual interest. The message was formal and carefully neutral in tone, making no reference to our last interaction at the family dinner or to any of the tensions that encounter had made explicit. The framing as a business discussion rather than as family conversation suggested, he had determined that approaching me through professional context might be more effective than attempting direct engagement about personal relationships. I was skeptical about his motives but curious enough about what he might propose that I agreed to the meeting. We arranged to meet at a restaurant near my office, a location I selected deliberately to maintain home field advantage and to ensure the conversation could be concluded efficiently if it proved unproductive. I arrived exactly on time, finding my father already seated at a table reviewing something on his phone with the focused attention he brought to anything he considered important business. He greeted me with professional courtesy that acknowledged my presence without attempting false warmth or inappropriate familiarity. We ordered lunch and engaged in brief superficial conversation about neutral topics while waiting for food to arrive. The performance felt strange, this formal interaction with someone who had been a constant if often disappointing presence throughout my life, but I appreciated that he was at least attempting to respect the boundaries I had established rather than simply ignoring them and demanding engagement on his preferred terms. Once meals were served and the server had departed, my father transitioned to the stated purpose of our meeting. He explained that his real estate development company was expanding focus to include adaptive reuse of historic properties, recognizing that this represented an underserved market, niche with potential for both profit and positive community impact. His research into successful preservation and adaptive reuse projects had repeatedly led him to my name and my work. He had not fully realized until recently how much professional credibility and specialized expertise I had developed in this field. He proposed that I consider serving as a consultant to his company on their historic preservation projects, bringing my technical knowledge and creative problem-solving abilities to developments that would benefit from specialized expertise. The arrangement would be strictly professional, he emphasized, with appropriate compensation reflecting market rates for my level of experience and capability. He believed my involvement could help his company successfully enter this market segment, while providing me with opportunities to work on larger projects with more substantial resources than I typically access through my current consulting practice. I listened to his presentation without interrupting, noting both what he said explicitly and what remained carefully unaddressed. He made no acknowledgement of our personal relationship or of the family dynamics that had brought us to this point. He did not apologize for years of minimizing my achievements or for assuming at our last meeting that I would surrender my independence and my property to serve family interests. He simply moved directly to proposing a business relationship structured around his recognition that I possessed valuable professional capabilities he wanted access to. The proposal itself was not unreasonable from a purely professional perspective. Working on larger projects with greater resources would expand my capabilities and my portfolio. My father's company had established relationships and financial capacity that could facilitate preservation work at a scale I could not achieve independently. The compensation structure he outlined was genuinely fair, reflecting appropriate market rates rather than attempting to underpay based on family relationship or expectation that I should offer discounted services. But the proposal also represented a continuation of patterns I had spent weeks establishing boundaries against. My father had shown no interest in my professional work throughout the years I was building my expertise and reputation. Now that he recognized my capabilities could benefit his business interests, he suddenly wanted access to my time and knowledge. The timing made clear that his interest was transactional rather than relational, motivated by what I could provide rather than by genuine respect for what I had accomplished. I thanked him for the proposal and acknowledged that it had merit from a business perspective. Then I explained why I would be declining his offer. Working with his company would create ongoing professional entanglement with someone who had spent decades demonstrating that his interest in me was conditional on my usefulness to his priorities. The compensation would be fair, but the relationship dynamics would inevitably complicate the professional work in ways that would be neither healthy nor productive. I had built my career independently, I continued, establishing credibility based on the quality of my work, rather than on family connections or institutional backing. That independence was valuable to me both personally and professionally. Entering into business relationship with my father would compromise that independence regardless of how professional we attempted to keep the arrangement. The personal history between us would inevitably influence professional interactions in ways neither of us could fully control or prevent. My father's expression tightened as he processed that I was refusing his offer, though he maintained the professional composure he had brought to the meeting. He suggested that I was allowing personal feelings to interfere with sound business judgment, that the opportunity he was presenting represented significant professional advancement I was rejecting based on family issues that should be kept separate from business decisions. The framing attempted to position my boundary setting as emotional weakness, rather than as strategic choice, a familiar tactic he used when people did not accept his preferred outcomes. I responded calmly that maintaining separation between personal and professional relationships was precisely why I was declining his proposal. Our personal relationship was complicated by decades of patterns that would inevitably influence any professional collaboration. Choosing not to create additional entanglement was sound business judgment, not emotional interference. I wished him success with his company's expansion into historic preservation work, and suggested he seek consulting support from other qualified professionals whose relationships with him carried less personal history and complexity. He attempted several additional arguments pointing out specific projects his company had in development that would benefit from my expertise, describing the scale and visibility these projects could bring to my professional reputation, suggesting that I was limiting my own career advancement by refusing to work with him. Each argument revealed his continued inability to understand that professional success on his terms held no appeal for me if it required sacrificing the independence I had spent years establishing. The lunch concluded with polite but strained civility. My father clearly disappointed that his approach had not produced the outcome he desired but uncertain how to proceed when direct appeal to business logic had been insufficient to change my position. We parted with vague statements about staying in touch, the kind of hollow pleasantry that people offer when genuine connection seems unlikely but maintaining superficial cordiality still feels necessary. I returned to my office feeling both satisfied and slightly melancholic about the interaction. Maintaining boundaries required ongoing vigilance and willingness to disappoint people who wanted access on terms I found unacceptable. My father had at least attempted to engage with me in a context that acknowledged my professional capabilities, which represented some degree of progress from simply ignoring my existence until I acquired something he wanted. But the engagement remained fundamentally transactional, motivated by his business interests rather than by genuine desire for relationship or authentic recognition of my worth beyond my usefulness. The contrast between that lunch and the preservation work I had been immersed in during the previous week felt stark. In Ohio, my value had been determined entirely by the quality of analysis and solutions I could develop for complex preservation challenges. Local advocates and community members had been genuinely grateful for expertise and attention brought to buildings they cared about, but had lacked resources to preserve effectively. The work had created value that benefited people beyond myself, while allowing me to utilize capabilities I had spent years developing. My father's proposal, by contrast, centered entirely on how my expertise could advance his business interests. The benefit to me would have been financial and perhaps reputational, but the cost would have been ongoing entanglement with someone whose primary interest in me remained instrumental rather than relational. I had worked too hard to establish independence to compromise it for opportunities that came with strings attached to problematic relationship dynamics. That evening I returned to my apartment and spent time reviewing photographs from the Ohio trip, images of historic buildings waiting for someone to recognize their potential and invest in their preservation. The structures represented both challenges and opportunities, requiring substantial resources and expertise to restore, but offering unique architectural character and cultural significance that contemporary construction could not replicate. The preservation work connected present to past, honoring what previous generations had built while adapting it for contemporary needs and uses. My own life felt somewhat similar to those buildings, I realized. I had been constructed through specific historical circumstances, shaped by family dynamics and personal choices that had created both strengths and complications. The work of becoming fully myself required preserving what was valuable from that history while adapting to contemporary reality and future aspirations. The process was neither simple nor complete, but it was profoundly worthwhile, creating coherence and integrity that made the ongoing effort feel purposeful rather than burdensome. The villa waited across an ocean, representing tangible achievement and symbolic milestone. But the real preservation work was internal, the ongoing effort to maintain boundaries that protected independence while remaining open to relationships that honored rather than diminished who I was becoming. That work would continue long after the drama of family confrontation had faded into memory, but it was work that mattered in ways that transcended any single achievement or acquisition. It was the work of building a life that reflected authentic values rather than inherited expectations, and that work would define my journey far more than any property or professional accomplishment ever could. Winter arrived in the desert with its characteristic subtlety, temperatures moderating into comfortable ranges, while northern regions experienced the harsh weather that most people associated with the season. The shift brought changes beyond meteorological patterns, alterations in light quality and daily rhythms that created space for reflection and recalibration. The months following my establishment of boundaries with my family had produced outcomes both anticipated and surprising, reshaping relationships and clarifying priorities in ways that continued to unfold gradually rather than resolving into simple conclusions. Victoria and I had maintained our agreement to meet regularly, gathering every few weeks for coffee or lunch conversations that ranged from superficial, catching up to deeper explorations of family dynamics and personal growth. The relationship we were building bore little resemblance to the one we had possessed previously, when our interactions had been shaped primarily by our differential positions within family hierarchy and by the unspoken competition for limited parental attention. Without those pressures defining every exchange, we were discovering that we actually enjoyed each other's company and could offer each other perspectives that proved genuinely valuable rather than merely obligatory. During one of our December meetings, Victoria shared that she had been doing substantial thinking about her own career trajectory and life choices. She had always assumed that following the path our parents had constructed for her represented success, That working in the corporate environment they had facilitated access to and maintaining the lifestyle they approved of constituted the natural and appropriate direction for her life. But watching me establish independence and build a career according to my own values had prompted questions she had not previously allowed herself to consider seriously. She wondered aloud whether the work she did actually mattered to her beyond providing income and status. She questioned whether the recognition she received from our parents was worth the ongoing pressure to meet their expectations and validate their investment in her success. She described feeling simultaneously privileged by the advantages she had received and constrained by the obligations those advantages created. The conversation revealed depths to her experience that I had not fully appreciated, reminding me that being the favored child carried its own complicated burdens, even as it provided undeniable benefits. I listened without offering easy answers or suggesting she should make dramatic changes to mirror my own choices. Her path was hers to determine, and the advantages she had received were real resources she could utilize however she chose. But I shared honestly about how liberating it had been to build something entirely my own, to measure success by standards I set rather than by approval from people whose values did not necessarily align with mine. The conversation planted seeds that might or might not grow into changes for Victoria, but at minimum it created space for her to question assumptions she had previously accepted without examination. My mother had continued reaching out periodically, messages that oscillated between attempts at reconciliation and defensive justifications of past behavior. She seemed genuinely confused about why I remained distant despite her expressed desire to repair our relationship, unable or unwilling to understand that repair required acknowledgement and changed behavior rather than simply declaring that bygones should be bygones. Her communications revealed how little she understood about what I actually needed from her, how thoroughly she had constructed narratives that positioned her as a loving mother whose daughter was being unnecessarily difficult and unforgiving. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.